Well, we want to say welcome back to the Heights podcast. My name is Matt. I'm one of the pastors at Heights Baptist Church in Alvin, Texas, and our mission as a church is to love and to lead all people to a new life with Christ. One of the ways that we do that is by providing content like this one, like this podcast. At this podcast, we like to talk about faith, the culture, and the church, and we like to help people take their next step on their faith journey. Today, my guest is Gideon Sutherland. Gideon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So glad that you are here. You are not a stranger to podcasts.
No.
You actually are a veteran podcaster. Tell me a little bit about that.
I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as a veteran podcaster, but I have had two previously. Both of them not about anything holy, I would say, rather more sports driven. I led one podcast group with 4 guys a few years back, and we talked about soccer, and that grew to a pretty big following. We had thousands of thousands of listeners on multiple episodes. So it's something that I've done for a while and something I'm comfortable doing, so I'm really excited.
Very cool. Tell me a little bit, so as sort of an interdisciplinary ministry intern at Heights, tell me a little bit about kind of what you've been doing at the church through these past few weeks.
Yeah, totally. So I've been bouncing around with a bunch of our different ministers, and whether that be in administrative roles or worship roles or children's ministry, but I think one of the big things that I've been able to do is have conversations about what ministry looks like in an effective way, and how, and I've also been able to give input and feedback into some of the practices here at Heights, which has been great. Our ministry team has done a real good job at allowing me to be in the room to see the real meat and potatoes of what church life looks like, and that can be from building a bookshelf like this,
which is something that we all have to do from time to time.
Or taking out trash, or it can look like having conversations and being present for funerals, right? Mm-hmm. And being in the rooms when those things are getting planned, and also just being present for people, because what is ministry if we're not serving the body? Going to camp, right? Right. Going to camp, serving at VBS. This next week, we're going to have Survival Week for our youth, being able to serve there, getting opportunities to potentially write and preach in certain settings, right? And so just getting a complete overview of all the different aspects of ministry, whether that be financial or social or pastoral, like all these different things. So it's been great.
So tell us a little bit about Gideon. Tell me a little about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Gideon. What more is there? There's a lot, actually. Multiple things. I've grown up all over the nation, so a lot of people. I'm working here at Heights for the summer. Heights is in Alvin, Texas, as most of you listeners will know, but I haven't been here my entire life. My family's in Friendswood right now. I spent about 7 years in the greater Houston area, between Pearland and Alvin, but I have lived in New Jersey, in Ohio, in Kentucky, Tennessee. I'm going to University of Missouri right now at Evangel, so I've moved around a lot, but it's good to be here for the summer, that's for sure. Do
you have a particular area that's has been your favorite place to live?
Yeah, so I primarily grew up in Houston, so from the ages of 7 to 14, I was here in Pearland and Alvin, a little bit of both. And so I would say Houston's home. I would say one of my favorite areas, just from a geographical and cultural perspective, would probably be the Cincinnati, Louisville area. I have that love of sort of I'm a Midwestern guy, if I have to be real here. That's one of the reasons I'm going to a Midwestern school right now.
So tell me a little bit about school. Tell me about what you're studying in college.
Yeah, so I am a biblical studies philosophy double major, and for everybody who's listening, that means I'm a mega nerd. And I do a lot of reading, or at least I say I do a lot of reading, and I look up Wikipedia. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. But I am going into my junior year at Evangel University, and I'm going to be a residence assistant there. So I'm going to be leading a floor of guys this upcoming year as we live together and grow together and follow Christ together and worship together and learn together and just have a great time together. I'm really excited to be doing that with them. In biblical studies, I'm really preparing these last 2 years to pursue seminary afterwards in my postgraduate education. And I think this is the last 2 years, especially your junior year of college, as most people know, is like the grind year, as a lot of people like to view it. And especially as a double major, this is going to be one of my most heavily intensive years from a paper's perspective, but also just preparing my resume to potentially go off to a number of universities and a number of places that God is calling me.
Gotcha. I had the opportunity to preach a few weeks back, and I was talking a little bit about, I told the story about a guy that I knew that was my RA when I was in college. And I was just kind of, when we were talking about kind of collegiate ministry and being an RA or a resident advisor, that was a guy who just was really instrumental in some of my like spiritual development when I was in college. Talk to me a little bit about that. Like what does that kind of ministry look like when you're interacting like in a dorm situation? Like what does that ministry look like?
Yeah, so it's going to be my first year as a residence assistant. So I don't have necessarily the insider take about all the different variances, but I will say from the get-go, what's been communicated to me from my residence director and how we're going to be leading is, as an RA, you have a special opportunity to develop very deep and intimate relationships with guys that they may not ever be able to develop the rest of their life, while also leading them and honing them in the places and the events and the living situations that they're in. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so many people are coming from all different backgrounds. I'm going to a Christian university, but even then, you have kids who are coming from, they have never had an ounce of trouble in their life versus people who have had very traumatic upbringings, and mm-hmm. being able to, and just the variance in culture and the different types of people that you're interacting with. As an RA, you're trying to really build a family out of a group of vastly different people. And I think that's also sort of similar to what you're doing with the church. It's almost a smaller, more intimate version and image of us coming together every Sunday as a church, but it's just daily, right? Gotcha. And so being able to, one of the biggest things is like that I was asked during my interview process, and that was how do you handle people with different opinions and perspectives than you, and how can you make them feel like they're at home? Because it is their home. Right. And that's where they live. That's where they lay their head down, and they deserve to feel comfortable in those spaces and be able to be who they truly are.
Gotcha. We just got back from a week of junior high camp. And one of the things that I really enjoyed at junior high camp was just us getting a chance to get to know each other a little bit. We talked a lot about kind of seeing the world through the lens of a Gen Z generation. And some of the stuff that you told me kind of really surprised me. And so I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit, just sort of like what the kind of the cultural landscape of your generation, people in their 20s and kind of and what they see, and kind of what's different maybe than somebody from like a previous generation, and kind of like what some of those unique challenges are.
Yeah, totally. It's a wide topic to just jump right into. It's like jumping into the deep end of a pool. You could drown if you're not careful. I think there's a lot of misconceptions mm-hmm. about the state. I think there's a lot of valid misconceptions, I should say, because some of them are like, they're true in a halfway, if that makes sense.
Okay, can you give me an example?
I think my generation is starkly divided.
Oh, okay.
Is what I'm trying to say. So when you're seeing people who I think it's very one of the easiest labels to peg on any new generation is like a general laziness.
Yeah. And
I think that's very true, but I think it's not from a source of they're inherently lazy, rather they're trapped, if
Gotcha.
that makes sense. But then you have, and they're trapped by a multitude of things, but I would primarily chalk that up to an overindulgence in the internet.
Okay.
And how it works to actually isolate you rather than, as much as we're like, oh, I can connect with people all over the world, it's actually one of the greatest isolators.
Interesting.
I mean, people talk about it. I've heard people your age, people and older people, I've heard my grandparents even say it. It was like, you can go to a lunch, and if you see a group of Gen Z people, they're all going to be talking on their phones rather than in person. And I think that's a real reality. But I also would say there's a bunch of people who have realized that they want to live, right?
Gotcha.
And I'd say it's a growing group, and people are realizing it faster and sooner. And I'd say I'm very encouraged, especially with where young Christian people are heading with what they are prioritizing and what they are casting off. Like sort of like in Hebrews, it's like, do not let anything impede you. Cast off every burden so you may run the race faithfully, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a verse that I hear preached continuously and talked about continuously among people my age. And as we're really trying to cast off burdens. Mm-hmm. And one of those big burdens that I previously mentioned is things like unfiltered and unlimited internet use, because at the end of the day, you aren't living when you're there. Mm-hmm. You're living there instead of in the real world, and that's not how God designed us to operate.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I think that's so interesting when you talk about how, like in one way you are the most connected generation that there ever has been. Sort of like the dividing line between you and like a millennial who might be in their 30s is that the millennial will remember a time when they didn't have a smartphone, but your generation has essentially grown up, with smartphones like throughout your entire all your formative years, and so like the presence and the prevalence of that technology really kind of changed the game, especially when it comes to things like social media. One of the things, this is kind of a particular, this is a little bit of a particular soapbox of mine, but I think sometimes when we talk about differences between generations, sometimes I think we can mistake unique things about a generation with like a life stage, and I think every generation stretching back as far as I can remember has been accused of being lazy. Yeah. There was a time when the baby boomers were accused of being lazy. There was a time when Gen X was accused of being lazy. The millennials were accused of being accused of being lazy for years, and now Gen Z is, and now it's kind of their turn to be the punching bag. And so I think, and sometimes, and I think a portion of that, I do think part of that is that the presence of the internet, the presence of apps, the presence of technology has made some things like way easier in our lives. Yeah. I think that's true, and so every generation will say, when I was your age, I remember when our phone was attached to the wall and I had to remember people's phone numbers, because I grew up in the 80s. But then on the other hand, some of that is just young people being young people, and as you kind of mature and you grow into what it means to be an adult, you build yourself a work ethic, and I know I'm speaking like I'm really generalizing here, but I do think I always think it's important to be careful not to like assign unique generational characteristics to basically what is essentially a people that are in a particular life stage. A great example that I would say, and I think sometimes this comes through if you read well-meaning but kind of misguided books on church ministry or really more Facebook posts. Like if somebody were to say, it's really important to boomers as a generation, retirement. You know what I mean? And it's like, and that's not because of who they are, that's because of where they are. Yeah. A lot of people will say to millennials, what's really important to millennials is family. Now that might be true, but a lot of that is true because they are in their 30s and raising kids. You know what I mean? And so like Gen Z, well, they're really immature, or they might say something like, well, they're kind of just getting started as young adults. Yeah. So, but kind of with that in mind, like, are there any things that you would say are definitely unique to the challenges of the people that are in this generation that's like in their 20s?
Yeah, I sort of alluded to it earlier in the fact that It's a generation trapped, and they're trapped in a false reality, right? And I'm not some clunker who doesn't like the internet. I use it every day, right? And it just as it's one of the greatest tools for harm, it's one of the greatest tools for good and uplifting. But at the same time, when I can watch, do, even order food all on the internet, communicate with anybody that I need to, find entertainment in any method that I need to, I become isolated. And I think that was even thrown further into effect with COVID, right? Where you're now mandated to be trapped. And I think a lot of people just never came out of that, right? And a lot of people are just numb, right? They're numb. I think you've probably doom scrolled before, and that's not a feeling of I want to relax. That's not a feeling of I'm bored, so I'm doing this. That's a feeling of almost I don't even want to exist.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting way of looking at it.
I think really, and people like, oh, the dopamine hit. That's why they're addicted and all these things. And I think it's actually more of a deeper underlying issue of a true. Our generation has more than any generation has ever had before. As much as we can gripe about, oh, we're given an unfair shot in comparison to older generations, everything's more expensive now. We have more. The average person has more than anybody has ever had, period. Mm-hmm. And we're faced as a generation, and we're only 20, and at 20 we're realizing that wealth of things is not enough.
Interesting.
It's not enough. I still feel empty, and if I'm gonna feel empty, I might as well not even exist, or I might as well go to the very next thing, get my pleasure hit, my hedonism high, and continue on, because at the end of the day, I'm going to die anyways. And the lie that our secular culture has told these people is that, well, you're not going to exist then. And because you're not going to exist, it doesn't, like, everything operates on a nihilistic perspective. And for those who don't know what nihilism is, it means nothing matters because nothing, like, you don't exist anymore, nothing matters. And so with that, like, with how that's influenced with hedonism and everything, it just leads to an utter hopelessness. And I think that's what a lot of Gen Zers are already battling, and they might be unknowingly battling it, right? But it's the despair that they feel, right? So
kind of moving, kind of leaning into that, like, how do we as believers, how do we reach hope to the hopeless?
Yeah.
Like what is this group of people, what is this demographic like what are they looking for? What are they longing for when it comes to, like, church and faith community?
Yeah. So, there's two types. There's two groups here. There's three groups, really. Those who have woken up already, the woke, but when I mean the woke, I mean,
you're using that in a different sense.
I'm using it in a different sense, right? I'm using they're alive. They are living. The other group is those who grew up in Christian-based communities and are still most likely a part of Christian-based communities. They've heard the gospel, but they're in the middle of a battle with the entire world being offered to them, and the hope and the offer of Jesus Christ and eternal life. And then, of course, there's the unchurched, there's the common secularist, the agnostic who doesn't really know, the guy who hasn't really thought about that type of person, who are just utterly entrenched in almost targeted attacks at life, right? Because that's what they are. They're targeted attacks at life, and they want to live. And I think the most effective means to helping anybody who thinks that they don't want to, like, is trapped in this almost false reality, is trapped in this I don't want to live, is trapped in this almost this continuing pattern of sin feeding into sin, because that's what it is, death begetting death, is to invite them to live. In a practical way, is Pastor Lee talked about this in his sermon most recently, is hospitality. So what is inviting someone to live look like? It's inviting them over for dinner, because dinner and communion and eating together is living. It's living. And so I think a lot of old people, there's a lack of mentorship of young people right now, and that's on both sides, because we have not taken responsibility to respond. And I also think older people have somewhat failed our generation to reach out to mentor. That's how I've seen a lot of people who would love mentors but don't feel mentored. But I think there needs to be an invitation to live, to do things in the real world, to go eat together. I'm a big guy on the theology of food. That's like one of my things. I love talking about how we were designed to feast with God and with one another. And I think that starts on Sunday, but it also starts while you're sitting on a bus and you see someone plugged into their phone, dribbling away and starting a conversation. People want to have real conversations. They want to be able to talk to someone and hear someone's voice that's right next to them, rather than in the UK or in China or in Brazil.
Or watching a video.
They want actual feasible connection, because that's how we were designed to operate as humans. That's how God intended us to operate. And that's what you see throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament. Do not forsake the communion of saints. For that's one of the primary reasons, because you isolate yourself and you allow the enemy to kill you. You're weak when you're alone.
Gotcha. That's a good word. So when I was an undergrad, online school was brand new. In fact, I'm not sure I took any classes online when I was an undergrad. I may have done it all in person. When I was in graduate school, the first time I took a couple of things online. When I was in seminary, I took a good chunk of things online, because I was at a pretty small school, and so there were a lot of options that were only available online. When you're going through your undergrad right now, are you doing predominantly in person on campus, or is it a lot of online, or is it kind of a hybrid?
So it really depends. Certain courses are only going to be offered online anymore.
Oh, gotcha.
But for the most part, I'm doing a completely in-person degree format, and I would prefer it that way. I don't want to be disconnected. I think there's something to say to a present classroom and what's actually being able to be communicated versus me watching a video and taking some quizzes.
Yeah.
I'd say there's been a much bigger shift towards online learning, and I think for certain people it's the right decision. Whether that be for financial reasons or just you're not near a good university, a good faithful Christian university, and you want a good faithful Christian education, or you might not be near a program that best suits you, right? So I think it's a double-edged sword sometimes, because you can get drawn into an isolating sphere, or just I just don't think necessarily that complete online education may be the most effective means of educating. As someone who wants to be a professor in the future, I don't think that that's necessarily the most effective way at shaping people who are going into fields, especially fields that are very interpersonal.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Join us next week as Gideon and I continue our conversation. We talk about Bible translations, theology, theophanies, and some other great deep dive topics. We'll see you next time.